Platte River Valley, Nebraska, August 1891. The sun was a hammer on an anvil of baked earth. Dust, fine as flour, rose from the wagon wheels and settled on everything, turning the green of the sparse cottonwoods to a dull, funereal gray. To the settlers of the valley, this was building season, a frantic race to raise walls and roofs before the first killing frost. They built with what they knew, logs hauled from the river bottoms, cut and notched with practiced efficiency, solid, square, sensible. But what Władysława Nowak was doing was not sensible. She was not building with logs. She wasn't even building on her own small plot of land. Every morning, before the sun had cleared the horizon, she hitched her weary mule to a stone boat and began hauling scavenged bricks to the old, abandoned grain silo on the edge of the co-op lands. The silo was a monument to failure, erected 5 years prior during a bumper wheat crop and left to rot after 2 years of drought and 1 of locusts. It was a concrete cylinder, 20 feet across and 30 feet high, its roof long since torn away by the wind. A useless, ugly thing. Inside this concrete shell, the Polish widow was meticulously laying a second inner wall of brick. She worked alone, her small, wiry frame a study in relentless motion. Her children, 10-year-old Stanisław and 7-year-old Zofia, helped where they could, mixing mortar in a shallow pit and carrying bricks one by one to their mother. "It's madness," Jedediah Crane said, reining in his horse to watch from a distance. He was talking to Silas Croft, another farmer whose land bordered the co-ops. Building a chimney with no house around it? Silas spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. Worse, she's nesting, like a damn bird in a hollow tree, thinks that concrete will stop a Nebraska winter. The consensus was clear. The woman was touched by grief and hardship. Her husband had died the previous spring, and now she was building a foolish memorial. It was a tragedy, but it was also becoming a problem. The problem arrived in the form of Fenner Galt, chairman of the Platte Valley Farmers Cooperative. He rode up, not on a farm horse, but on a fine bay mare, a sign of his status. He was a man who believed in order, in deeds, and in the sound, proven geometry of the square-cornered log cabin. He dismounted and approached the silo, his boots crunching on fallen concrete. "Mrs. Nowak," he said, his voice firm, but not yet unkind. Władysława paused, a brick in one hand, a trowel in the other. She straightened her back, wiping a smear of mortar from her brow with her forearm. She did not speak. "Mrs. Nowak, you are on co-op property," Galt stated. "This structure belongs to the members. You cannot build here. You are trespassing." He held out a folded piece of paper. "This is a formal notice. The co-op board requires you to cease work and vacate the premises." Władysława looked at the paper, then at the half-finished brick circle rising around her. She looked at her children, who had fallen silent and stood close to her skirts. Finally, her eyes met Galt's. "The winter will not wait, Mr. Galt," she said, her voice quiet, accented, but clear as glass. Then she turned back to her wall, picked up a dollop of mortar with her trowel, and laid the next brick. It was the act of a woman who had already made a decision beyond appeal. Fenner Galt was left standing in the dust, holding a piece of paper that suddenly felt as useless as the silo itself. The whole valley thought she was a fool. What did this Polish grain tower builder understand about thermal mass that the most experienced log home builders in Nebraska had missed? The answer to that question would not only save her family, but would eventually change the way Loco built and survived on the unforgiving plains. But before we see how her strange brick circle performed in the heart of a blizzard, take a moment to subscribe to this channel and ring the notification bell. I promise you will learn the fundamental physics of how ancient building techniques can outperform modern assumptions and you'll see firsthand how a single quiet decision can overcome the loudest chorus of doubt. Let me know in the comments, what's the most unconventional home you've ever seen? Władysława Nowak was not a frontierswoman. She was not a farmer's wife in the way the Valley understood the term. Before Nebraska, she had been the daughter and then the wife of a murator, a master builder from Pomerania on the Baltic coast. Her world had not been one of wood and sod, but of brick and fire. Her husband, Jan, had not built houses. He had built the massive cylindrical brick towers that stored the region's grain and the great beehive-shaped kilns that fired the clay into vitrified hardness. She hadn't just watched him work, she had been his apprentice. She understood the language of mortar, the precise chemistry of sand, lime, and water. Her hands knew the heft of a good brick, the sound it made when tapped, indicating it was free of cracks. Jan had taught her that a structure's strength was not in its individual pieces, but in their perfect union. But more than that, he taught her the physics of heat. "Wood burns, Władysława," he would say, his hands dusty with brick powder. "But brick drinks the fire. It holds it for you. It keeps it safe." They had come to America seeking land, a place for their children, Stanisław and Zofia, to grow. The advertisements had promised a gentle, rolling paradise. They had found the Platte River Valley, which was flat, treeless, and ruled by a sky that could deliver scorching heat one month and soul-crushing cold the next. They built as their neighbors did, a one-room log cabin chinked with mud and straw. Jan, for all his skill with masonry, was a novice with an axe. Their cabin was serviceable, but it was a creature of wood. Their first winter in 1890 was a brutal education. The cabin was a sieve for heat. They kept the cast-iron stove glowing red-hot, burning through their precious woodpile at a terrifying rate. They could be sweating on one side, facing the fire, while their backs remained chilled. The moment the fire died down to embers, the cold would pour back in. Władysława would wake in the middle of the night to a silence that meant the fire was out, the temperature already plummeting. By morning, a thick layer of frost coated the inside of the walls, sparkling in the weak light. The blankets were always damp. The children were always coughing. The heat they generated didn't last. It fled through the thin log walls by dusk, lost to the infinite cold of the prairie. That winter stole the breath from Jan's lungs. A deep cough settled in his chest in January and never left. He died of pneumonia in April, the week the first green shoots appeared on the plains. As she stood over his simple grave, Władysława made a vow. She would not lose her children to the cold. She would not fight the winter with fire alone. She would fight it with memory, with knowledge, with the lessons of the kiln and the grain tower. She would build a structure that didn't just get warm, but one that stayed warm. She would build a place that drank the fire. The failure of the standard frontier cabin was not a failure of effort or of materials. It was a failure of physics. The men who built them, like Fenner Galt and Jedediah Crane, were skilled craftsmen. They could hew a log flat with an adze and cut a dovetail joint so tight you couldn't slip a knife blade in it. Their cabins were sturdy, respectable, and from the outside they looked like fortresses against the winter. But they were thermal disasters. The problem wasn't the wood itself. A thick, dry log has a decent R value, a measure of its resistance to conductive heat flow. A typical 10-inch log wall was roughly equivalent to a modern 2x4 wall with a bit of insulation. The real issue was twofold: air leakage and a near total lack of thermal mass. No matter how well built, a log cabin had hundreds of feet of seams, between the logs, around the doors, around the windows. As the wood seasoned, it shrank and twisted, opening up new gaps. The chinking, a mixture of mud, clay, and grass, would dry, crack, and fall out. On a windy day, a family could literally watch the flame of a candle flicker and dance, tracing the paths of the icy drafts. Every BTU of heat generated by their stove was immediately challenged by an invading BTU of cold. They were trying to heat the entire state of Nebraska, one armload of wood at a time. Fenner Galt's cabin was considered the finest in the area. It had 2 rooms and a sleeping loft, with windows that had real glass panes shipped by rail from Omaha. Yet even in his home, the winter nights were a constant battle. His wife, Martha, stuffed rags into the window frames and hung heavy quilts over the doors. They burned through more than 10 cords of cottonwood each winter, a staggering amount of labor to fell, haul, split, and stack. The corners of their rooms were always degrees colder than the center, zones of perpetual chill where frost would linger long after sunrise. This was a classic case of thermal bridging, where the geometry of a corner provides a faster path for heat to escape. But the most fundamental failure was the lack of thermal mass. Thermal mass is an object's ability to absorb, store, and later radiate heat energy. Wood, for all its virtues, is lightweight. It heats up quickly, and it cools down just as fast. The heat from the stove warmed the air in the cabin and the surface of the logs, but it didn't penetrate deeply. The log walls acted as a thin, leaky barrier. They stored almost no energy. When the fire went out, the stored heat was negligible. The cabin's temperature would then begin a rapid plunge toward equilibrium with the outside air. Within 2 or 3 hours on a cold night, a cabin could go from 60 degrees to 20 degrees. It was a cycle of intense heating, followed by rapid, dangerous cooling. The settlers weren't living in a heated space. They were camping next to a fire inside a box that leaked. Władysława understood this in her bones. She had watched Jan fire the great kilns back in Pomerania. The process took days. For the first day, a small fire would slowly heat the tons of brick. Then, the fire would be built higher, roaring for 2 full days, pouring immense energy into the structure. Then, the kiln would be sealed. The fire was gone, but the heat remained, trapped in the mass of the brick, slowly and evenly baking the pottery within for another 3 days. The kiln was a battery for heat. The log cabins of Nebraska were not. They were baskets for carrying water. The work was brutal. Władysława rose before dawn, her muscles aching from the previous day. Her first task was scavenging. She found a collapsed brickworks 5 miles downriver, a failed enterprise from a decade before. The owner had defaulted, leaving behind thousands of imperfect, slightly warped bricks. To a house builder, they were useless. To Władysława, they were treasure. She paid the county clerk $2 for the salvage rights. Every day, she and Stas would make 2 trips with the mule and stone boat, hauling 400 pounds of brick on each run. Back at the silo, she became a mason. Inside the 20-foot diameter concrete shell, she began laying her own wall. It was not a thin veneer. It was a massive 18-inch thick, solid brick cylinder, set about 4 inches away from the concrete silo wall, creating a crucial dead air space. This was not a simple bricklaying job. Building a perfect, load-bearing curve requires a master's eye. Every brick had to be placed with minute adjustments to maintain the circle. Her neighbors saw a woman piling up crooked bricks. She was building a structure of immense compressive strength where every brick was supported by its neighbors in a continuous arch. Fenner Galt made good on his threat. A week after his first visit, the county sheriff rode out and served Władysława with a formal notice to vacate for trespassing. It gave her 30 days to dismantle her work and leave the property. He was not a cruel man, but he was a man of the co-op, and the silo was a co-op asset, however useless. "The board is concerned about liability, ma'am," the sheriff explained, looking uncomfortable. If this thing you're building falls on you or your children... Władysława took the papers. She could not read the English words, but she understood their meaning. She nodded, folded the document, and placed it on a rock. Then she picked up her trowel. Proszę powiedzieć panu Galt, she said, her Polish firm and formal, że zima nie czyta papierów. Please tell Mr. Galt that the winter does not read papers. The sheriff, bewildered, could only tip his hat and ride away. The mockery continued, now tinged with a new edge of concern over her defiance of the co-op. Fighting God is like fighting the river, Silas Croft commented to anyone who would listen. She'll be swept away. Władysława was undeterred. She installed a small, efficient cast-iron stove, venting it through a flue pipe that rose through the center of the structure. She didn't build a massive, heat-wasting fireplace. Her stove was for heating the bricks, not the air. She salvaged window frames and set them into the brickwork, facing south to catch the low winter sun. For a roof, she laid thick timbers across the top of her 18-inch brick wall, not the silo, and covered them with tar paper and a thick layer of sod. From the outside, it looked like the ruin had simply grown a green cap. By mid-October, as the first cold winds began to scour the valley, she and her children moved in. The inside was a single, large, circular room. It was stark, simple, and to the eyes of her neighbors, utterly alien. They had built their home inside the kiln. To understand why Władysława Nowak's silo was so revolutionary, you have to understand the principle of thermal mass. It's a concept often overlooked in an era focused on insulation, but it's just as important. Insulation, measured by R value, is a material's resistance to letting heat pass through it. Thermal mass, on the other hand, is a material's capacity to store heat. Think of it like this. Insulation is a good coat. It keeps your body heat from escaping quickly. Thermal mass is a hot water bottle. It absorbs heat from another source, boiling water, and then slowly releases that heat over many hours. A log cabin was like wearing a thin coat. Władysława's brick home was like sleeping with a giant, warm, hot water bottle. Let's look at the numbers. A cubic foot of the local cottonwood, once dried, weighs about 24 pounds. A cubic foot of brick weighs 120 pounds, 5 times as much. For every degree you raise its temperature, that cubic foot of brick can store vastly more heat energy, measured in British thermal units or BTUs, than the wood. Władysława's inner wall was a cylinder roughly 17 feet in diameter on the inside, 18 inches thick, and 10 feet high. A quick calculation shows that she used over 25 tons, 50,000 pounds, of brick. Her neighbors' log cabins, though larger in square footage, contained less than half that in total mass. When Władysława lit a fire in her small stove, she wasn't just heating the air. The stove radiated heat in all directions. That thermal radiation struck the immense curved brick wall and was absorbed. For the first few days, the fire ran constantly, pouring thousands of BTUs of energy into the brick. The brick was drinking the fire, just as her husband had said. It was charging the thermal battery. The circular shape was also a work of genius, born from her experience with kilns. A square room has 4 corners. These corners are geometric thermal bridges, areas where there is more exterior surface area relative to the interior volume, providing a fast lane for heat to escape. A circle has no corners. The interior surface area is minimized relative to the volume it encloses, and the distance from the central heat source to any point on the wall is roughly equal. Heat radiated from the stove and was absorbed evenly by the entire structure. Once the wall was saturated with heat, it began to radiate that warmth back into the living space, creating an environment of profound thermal stability. The heat didn't come from one direction, as it did in a log cabin. It came from everywhere. Furthermore, The 4-inch air gap between her brick wall and the outer concrete silo acted as a layer of insulation, trapping still air and preventing the warmth stored in the bricks from being conducted directly to the cold outer shell. The concrete silo, once a symbol of failure, was now a windbreak and a first line of defense against the elements, protecting the precious thermal battery within. Władysława had created a system, a thermal mass core, an insulating air gap, and a protective outer shell. It was brutally simple and profoundly effective. The winter arrived not as a guest, but as an invader. It began in late November with a week of gray, bone-chilling dampness. Then the first snows came, dusting the valley in white. By the second week of December, the real cold descended. A Siberian air mass, as the newspapers would later call it, slid down from Canada and settled over the plains. Temperatures dropped to 10 below zero, then 15, then 20 below. The wind was relentless, a physical presence that found every crack and seam in the valley's log cabins. For Jedediah Crane's family, life shrank to the few feet around their stove. They lived in coats and hats, their breath pluming in the air of their own home. The woodpile, which had seemed so large in October, was dwindling at a terrifying pace. At Fenner Galt's house, the expensive glass windows were opaque with a thick, fern-like frost. Every morning he had to take a kettle of hot water just to free the kitchen door from the ice that had sealed it shut overnight. The cold was a thief, stealing sleep, stealing comfort, stealing fuel. Inside the silo, a different reality prevailed. After the initial charging period, Władysława needed only a small, steady fire for a few hours in the morning and a few in the evening to keep the brick wall saturated with warmth. The 25 tons of brick, heated to an average of 70 degrees, held a tremendous reservoir of thermal energy. That energy slowly and constantly radiated into the circular room. The temperature inside never dropped below 60 degrees, even overnight when the fire was just embers. The contrast with the outside was a staggering 80 degrees. The air was still. There were no drafts. The only sound was the quiet hiss of the stove and the whisper of the wind high overhead, a distant, harmless thing. This stillness was the proof of her success. It allowed for a life that was impossible for her neighbors. Zofia sat at a small wooden table, practicing her letters on a slate, her fingers nimble, not stiff and blue with cold. Stas, sitting on the floor, was mending a leather harness, the wax on his thread pliable and soft. Władysława herself was able to cook, to sew, to plan. The cold was not in the room with them. It was a defeated enemy held at bay by a fortress of stored warmth. They were not just surviving. They were living. The mockery of the summer felt like a memory from another lifetime. On the third day of the deep freeze, the sky turned a strange, bruised yellow, and the wind fell into an unnerving silence. Every farmer in the valley knew the sign. A blizzard was coming. By midday, the first flakes began to drift down. By 3 o'clock, the world had disappeared into a churning vortex of white. The wind howled, driving snow with the force of sand, piling it into massive drifts that buried fences and reshaped the landscape. Fenner Galt had spent the morning checking on his livestock. As the storm hit, he was making his way back to his house when he saw a plume of dark smoke rising from the direction of the Crane property. A chimney fire. In this wind, it was a death sentence for a cabin. He fought his way through the blinding snow, arriving to find Jedediah and his family frantically throwing snow onto their smoldering roof. They had saved the house, but the chimney was damaged and unusable. They were without heat in the heart of the worst storm in a decade. Galt's house was a mile away, an impossible journey. The nearest shelter was the one he had spent the last 3 months trying to tear down. "The silo," he yelled to Crane over the wind. "The Polish woman's place." There was no other choice. Galt led the way, guiding the half-frozen Crane family through the blizzard. They stumbled toward the abandoned structure, a place of folly and trespass. He could barely see it through the swirling snow, but the low, round shape was unmistakable. There was no smoke from its flue, a fact that sent a fresh wave of dread through him. Had her fire gone out? Were they already frozen inside? He pounded on the heavy wooden door. For a moment there was no answer. Then the bolt scraped back and the door opened a few inches. Władysława Nowak stood there, her face calm, holding a lamp. The first thing that hit Fenner Gault was not the sight of the room, but the feeling of the air. It was not air. It was warmth. A solid, palpable, gentle wave of heat that washed over his frozen face and made the skin begin to ache with life. He had expected to step from a blizzard into a smoky, frigid cave. He stepped from the blizzard into summer. He ushered the Crane family inside, their teeth chattering, their faces masked with ice. Władysława closed the door, and the roar of the storm was instantly muffled, reduced to a distant whine. Gault stood there, dripping meltwater onto the packed earth floor, his senses struggling to comprehend the scene. The air was perfectly still and smelled faintly of drying herbs and baking bread. The children, Stas and Zofia, looked up from a game of checkers, their faces placid. They were in their shirt sleeves. He looked for the source of the heat. The stove was there, but it was burning low, its metal cherry red but not roaring. It couldn't possibly be producing this much warmth. His gaze traveled around the curved wall. He took off his thick gloves and, driven by a deep, instinctual need to understand, he walked to the wall, furthest from the stove. He expected it to be cold, perhaps even coated in frost, like the walls of his own home. He pressed his bare palm flat against the brick. It was warm, not hot, not burning. It was the deep, penetrating, living warmth of a sun-baked stone on an autumn afternoon. It was radiating heat into the room. He ran his hand across the surface. The entire wall was warm. Every brick was a small sun. The cold wasn't being fought back. It simply had no place to enter. The structure wasn't being heated. The structure was the heat. He turned to Władysława, who was quietly handing mugs of hot broth to the Crane children. All his certainty, all his legal papers, all his confidence in the square-hewn logic of the frontier dissolved in that moment of contact. He finally understood. "My God," he whispered, his voice hoarse. He looked from the warm brick to the small, determined woman. "You didn't build a house. You built a kiln for living in." When the blizzard broke 3 days later, Fenner Gault was a changed man. He had spent those days in the quiet, steady warmth of the silo, watching Władysława manage her thermal battery with a small, efficient fire, observing a level of comfort he had never believed possible in a Nebraska winter. The contrast between the howling chaos outside and the profound peace within was absolute. At the next co-op meeting that spring, Gault stood before the assembled farmers. He formally withdrew the eviction notice against Władysława Nowak. Then he went further. He held up a piece of paper, but it wasn't a legal summons. It was a ledger of his own wood consumption for the winter compared to the estimate of Władysława's. His family had burned 12 cords of wood to live in a state of constant chill. She had used less than 3 to live in perfect comfort. The numbers were stark, undeniable. "We have been building wrong," he announced to the stunned room. "We have been fighting the cold. Mrs. Nowak has been storing the warmth. She did not trespass on co-op property. She improved it beyond measure." He proposed that the co-op not only grant Władysława a deed to the land her home stood on, but that they invest in converting the other 3 abandoned silos using her exact methods. He argued it was the most sensible investment they could make, an investment in survival. The motion passed unanimously. That summer, Władysława Nowak was not a pariah but a respected consultant. She oversaw the construction of the new silo homes, teaching the men the unfamiliar art of building in the round, of creating a dead airspace, of understanding that mass, not just a barrier, was the key to defeating the cold. By the following winter, 2 more families were living in warm, efficient brick cylinders. The idea began to spread beyond the silos. Farmers started adding thick brick walls to the inside of their existing log cabins, building them around the stove to create a thermal core. The local newspaper in Kearney ran a feature story titled, "The Polish Woman's Secret, a Kiln for Living In." The era of the cold, drafty cabin in the Platte River Valley was beginning to end. The quiet genius of Władysława Nowak's silo home was its anticipation of principles that would become central to building science a century later. Her use of a massive interior wall to absorb and radiate heat is the core concept behind a trombe wall, a key element in modern passive solar design. Her understanding of the relationship between mass, insulation, and solar gain, through her south-facing windows, demonstrated a sophisticated grasp of thermodynamics. Engineers today use complex software to model heat flow and energy efficiency, but their conclusions often lead back to the fundamental truths Władysława knew from the tradition of kiln building, that a building's envelope should be a system, that storing energy is as important as generating it, and that sometimes the most effective technologies are not the newest, but the most ancient. Her home was a testament to the power of deeply understood physics, applied with simple, locally available materials. There is a profound lesson in the story of the silo. The community saw a ruin, a symbol of failure, a piece of useless junk cluttering the landscape. It was a monument to what was lost, a failed crop, a broken dream. Władysława Nowak looked at the same empty cylinder and saw a container. She saw the perfect vessel, not for grain, but for life. She saw a shape that could hold the one resource more precious than any harvest: warmth. Her innovation was not an act of invention, but of translation. She took an ancient form from her homeland, the kiln, the grain tower, and applied its logic to a new and desperate problem. It reminds us that progress does not always lie in creating something the world has never seen. Sometimes, the most powerful breakthroughs come from seeing the hidden potential in what the world has chosen to forget. True wisdom lies not just in knowing how to build, but in knowing what is worth keeping. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the past. If you found this story of ingenuity and survival valuable, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more tales of practical wisdom from the frontier. And be sure to ring the bell so you don't miss our next episode. Disclaimer: this video presents a historically inspired reconstruction for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, but the building techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices. The application of any building technique today should be done in accordance with modern building codes, safety guidelines, and professional consultation. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.